All right, the man that you are all waiting to work with is here. And Dr. Matcheck, again, is the person that I would suggest that you spend a lot of time with on the breaks and over the lunch period as it relates to finalizing topics related to the courses, and ask for suggestions as it relates to what he's looking for with the papers, etc., because Dr. Matcheck and Dr. Ebling will be grading the papers for the Freedom Seminar. You are in for a treat if you haven't had Dr. Matcheck as a professor. Dale has been a longtime friend. In fact, the Matchecks and the Nashes go way back, and it was through my younger brother and Dale's older brother that we became aware of Dr. Matcheck and stole him away from the University of Michigan to bring him here to Northwood University. Dr. Matcheck has an undergraduate degree from the University of Michigan. His doctorate is in economics from Cornell University, and he is the chair of our economics department here at Northwood University. Dale is an economist of a very strong reputation. He is a very good writer. He's a very good speaker. He is involved in a number of things at the university. He edited and co-authored a book that we received a $200,000 grant to write on environmental economics. He's the co-author, co-editor of When We Are Free, with the foreword by Milton Friedman. And he had an article in our latest publication, In Defense of Capitalism, and we'll have another article in the upcoming edition of In Defense of Capitalism. He is just simply an all-around guy. He's a Renaissance man, a very talented musician, and this morning he is going to be speaking on the topic of the middle class, an endangered species. Would you please welcome Dr. Dale Matcheck.
Thank you, Tim. Okay. This is kind of odd with the pillars here. First of all, can you hear me if I walk around? Okay. I probably want to walk around a little bit. I chose my topics for the Freedom Seminar because I wasn't sure of the answer to the questions that I was asking. When Tim asked me to make a couple of presentations, I wanted to, well, there are a couple of things on my mind I wanted to research. And so in the process of preparing for this talk, I've been reading dozens of articles, books, so forth. And even still, I haven't finished my thinking about these questions. I don't know if you guys have put any thought into this question, or if you come into it with a preconception or with some ideas, some preliminary ideas. I know I did, and my ideas have changed quite a bit. And maybe what we learned today, your ideas will change quite a bit. And in any case, it's still an open-ended question with me, but I hope that through today's topic, or today's discussion, that we'll get closer to a better understanding of this question about the middle class. And later this afternoon about green jobs. So I feel like I can't see this table over here. What if I... How's that? Everybody see me? Am I still in camera range, Dale? Sure. All right. Paul Krugman is a Nobel Prize-winning economist. He's a very smart man. Don't always agree with his opinions. Writes a column for the New York Times and blogs quite a bit. He recently wrote a book called The Conscience of a Liberal. And in that book, he kind of bemoans the loss in America of a kind of a value system where equality was something that we could take for granted, that the richest weren't that rich compared to the poor, and there was a kind of sense of responsibility that employers felt for their workers, and work ethic that workers felt for their employers, and it was kind of this world where we're all for one and one for all. And he says that that was a kind of departure from our history, in the sense that just prior to that period, he says, we had something called a Gilded Age, where the difference between the rich and the poor was so stark. And you had poor people at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution living in poverty and squalor and doing all this work, and you had rich people, billionaires, millionaires, who were living in huge mansions and in great luxury. And the gap between the rich and the poor was huge during the Gilded Age. And then it was compressed. Krugman calls it the Great Compression. Really, he says this started during World War II and continued after World War II, and he says right through the 1970s, he says. Now, what caused the Great Compression? He's talking about income distribution being compressed. Actually, it's appropriate that we're in Detroit. He attributes it to something he calls the Detroit Compact. Basically, strong labor unions, strong labor protections, and actually protectionism in terms of trade as well, a little bit. He basically says that labor was much stronger in those days, and that was okay with management. It was a capital labor accord, if you will. Okay? And he says, we're now entering, and have entered for a number of years, for about 30 years now, into the second Gilded Age. We're going back not only to those income distributions where the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, he says, even attitudes are changing. It's now we're moving more to an attitude where CEOs are taking multi-million-dollar bonuses while they're slashing jobs at the bottom of the corporate ladder and so forth. So this new heartlessness among the American elites. And he says this shows up in the data, and he goes through a lot of data to show how, most of the income that's been generated by economic growth in the 30 years leading up to today has gone to the top 1% of the income distribution. Now, I don't know. He's a smart guy, but I don't necessarily think that he's correct about this. And so I wanted to investigate this for myself, and I wanted to see what other people were writing about it. And that really is what inspired his talk. It's kind of a response to this narrative that we're entering a new Gilded Age, and the rich have gotten richer and the poor have gotten poorer, and America is no longer a land of rising aspirations for the poor and the middle class. My conclusion is that scenario is false. I don't agree with it, and I hope to show you why. And yet there are some elements of it I found that are true. And those things, I think, are challenges to us. We need to work on those. There are some problems that will require some real creative solutions, especially in the area of public policy, but also in our own personal choices. So that's where we're going. I forgot my little controller. Thank you. Krugman's not the only one who believes that, who believes in that narrative that we're entering a new Gilded Age. Here's a couple of quotes from some economists whose names you might know. Robert Reich, the former Secretary of Labor. Almost all the benefits of economic growth since the 1970s have gone to a small number of people at the very top, he says. Since the mid-1970s, income growth has been confined almost entirely to the top earners, Bob Frank says. And these are influential people. And their editorials and their books and their articles are widely read. And if you repeat something often enough, then it becomes the conventional wisdom. And I think that if you were in conversation with people on the street and you said something like this, well, most of the gains have gone to the top earners. Nothing for us. I mean, if you said that, I think it would pretty much be accepted without dispute. I think this has become the common knowledge or the conventional wisdom. And this is why. It's graphs like this. Now, when you look at this graph, first of all, how do we interpret it? This is a graph where we're looking at the gains in wealth, or the gains in income, of the 5 segments of the U.S. income distribution. So the poorest fifth, then the next fifth, the middle fifth, the fourth fifth, and the fifth fifth. So the wealthiest people on the right there, you can see what's happened to their real income after taxes. From 1979 to 2004, their income after taxes rose by 176%. And you can see that at the bottom, real income rose, but by a paltry 6%. Now, compared to the gains in living standards experienced by their parents, this is a relatively disappointing result. For roughly 25 years to have your incomes grow by only 6%, especially since there's so much income that's been generated. Is there something going on that allows the wealthy Americans to grasp a larger share of the economic pie? Well, I think that the numbers are misleading for a number of reasons. And this is what some of the questions that I hope to deal with today. I'm not going to answer these questions now, but I would like you to think about these questions before we get started. Maybe think about what your preconceptions are. First of all, what do you think about those numbers? I mean, that comes directly from the Census Bureau, and numbers collected by the IRS are similar, so seems pretty straightforward, right? Can we trust the numbers? Secondly, okay, let's suppose the numbers are true. So what? As long as every group has gained a little bit, so what? As long as everybody... Should we care about relative income, or should we care more just about absolute income? If we do have rising inequality, then what's causing it? We need to know that so we can answer the last question, what's fixing it? Now, I would like some understanding of where you guys are starting out. So if I could ask some volunteers, if you think about some of these questions, let's not worry about the numbers at first, but focus on the next question. Should we be concerned about inequality? Does inequality matter? Does it make any difference to you if the guy at the top of your company is earning 50 times as much as the guy at the bottom? Yes?
There was a speech given by Margaret Thatcher once
Mm-hmm.
in the House of Commons where she was causing these huge differences between the rich and the poor. And the response she gives them is that the Socialist Party would rather have poor poorer, so she would have the rich poor. What she's basically saying is that the difference between the rich and poor doesn't matter if everyone at the same time is given a better standard of living.
Mm-hmm.
So richer did get more rich in the same period of time, but the standard of living rose for the poor too. They did not get poor, and that created inequality in that way.
Okay. So basically, you can have equality of misery, and equality of misery is no real benefit to people. Better to have a little inequality with comfort. Any other opinions or comments on that? What about fairness? Anybody concerned about the fairness of that? About a CEO who makes $20 million and fires a secretary making $18,000 because he's trying to save his company a little money? Yeah.
Personally, I think that that's unfair. I think that it's fair for CEOs to make more money than the people at the bottom because they have more responsibility. They're the ones that are truly running the company, but for them to be firing people so that they can make more money, I don't know, I think that that's wrong personally.
Okay. Do you think, does anybody feel that it, well, let's get to the root causes question. What might be causing this rise in inequality? What might be different today than 20 years ago? Yeah.
Have to do with globalization and leveling out of the markets.
Okay. So what does globalization do? I thought globalization was good for...
Well, I mean, it shifts the labor, but there's going to be a period, since we're such an industrialized country, there's going to be a period where our middle class is going to shrink while other countries catch up, then in the long run will prosper overall. We don't see that in the short term. We have to do short-term knowledge.
Okay. So the theory is that we're in a new competitive environment because of globalization. Well, are there any other root causes that come to mind? Yes?
I think it has to do with technology and everything. Just these workers are expected to take on more responsibilities. You don't need as many people working in one department, so you're just expected to take on one task, get that done.
So labor-saving technology and...
Yeah, you don't need 10 people to do one job. I need one person.
Yeah. So labor has become redundant in the new economy. Okay, these are interesting ideas, and we'll come back to these questions a little bit later, and I'll share my ideas about these questions as well. But before we get anywhere, we're going to have to, examine, the numbers and what they mean about inequality. Now, you may have come across this before. The Lorenz curve is something I want you to be familiar with, because you're actually going to construct a Lorenz curve in a few minutes. So if you have any questions, be sure to ask the questions and get them answered before we get too far. Basically, the Lorenz curve divides groups. Now, I've divided this into 4. Traditionally, we go with 5, but I wanted to simplify a little bit. 4 groups according to their wealth and income. So, we've got people arranged according to income here. And then on the other side, we look at how much of the total income in society goes to that group. So it's like a big pie. How big is the slice that goes to the poorest fourth? It's going to be 4 slices, but how big is that first slice? And similarly, if you were to add the first and the second slice together, how big would those 2 slices together be for the poorest and the second poorest group? And so forth. Do a quick example. Suppose we only have 4 people in the economy, and obviously their income is given here. So we've got 8% going to the poorest, 8% of the pie goes to them. If you add in the next group, we're talking about 28%. And the upper middle group gets another 32%, bringing our total to 60%. And finally, the richest group in this example gets 40% of the pie, bringing us to 100% of the pie. So that's what a Lorenz curve looks like. You're going to compute one in a minute. Do you have any questions on how to do it? I'm going to give you some income. It's going to be an experiment, or simulation, I guess. And I'm going to ask you, based on that income that I assign to each of you as individuals, what is the Lorenz curve for your tables? Okay? So hopefully you know how to do it. Now, after you get the numbers, then you graph it. This red line represents what would happen if the slices were equal size. If everybody got the same proportion of income. And the blue curve represents what happens when the pie is distributed unequally. Obviously, the further this blue curve is below that red curve, the more it dips down. That's what we call a vanishing middle class. Right? I mean, if you have this curve getting lower, that means, gosh, the portion of the pie going to the bottom half is small compared to what's been taken on the upper half, right? So the lower the curve, the more inequality in society. Okay. I knew I would be talking to you for 8 hours today, and I figured I'm not going to last that long, and you aren't going to last that long if I do all the talking. So, I think for the next half hour or so, you guys are going to be at your tables doing this exercise. It's a good way for me to take attendance as well and keep track of your participation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to distribute these cards. After you get your card, I'll tell you what to do with them. But for now, let's see, I think there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tables. So I'm going to distribute cards to, I guess, 2 tables at a time, and you 2 tables will constitute an economy. Okay? So every individual in the economy will get a card, and on the card you will find a little number. So for example, this one says 18 TH. TH is 1,000. 18,000. The person who gets this card has 18,000 in income. Okay? I'm just going to distribute these randomly to these 2 tables. You guys, yeah, that'll work. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay? With these 2 tables, I should tell you, the green cards, they're the ones you want. They're the ones that have the highest income. All right? So, I first of all want to ask at this table, do any of you know who the first female in space was? Wait, don't shout it out. Raise your hand. I'm asking for a name here. We got, okay. Good for you. Okay, can anybody tell me which amendment to the Constitution gives government the power to levy an income tax? Which amendment was that? Yes? No. Okay, I'm going to give you a yellow card. Because you took a risk and it didn't work out. All right? Well, I guess I'll ask a different one. Which amendment to the Constitution guarantees the rights of states to make any laws that are not permitted to the federal government? Which amendment? Which one? No. Sorry, you're going to have to get a blue card. Sorry about that. Oh, man. What else did you learn while you're here today? Let's see. Okay. How about an easier one? Oh, that's too easy. You guys will be insulted. Who was the chairman of the Federal Reserve before Ben Bernanke? Come on, Northwood. You're not at this table. All right. Have any of you been late for any of the sessions? Anybody missed a session? You sure? All right. Then the rest I'm just going to distribute randomly.
We've been early.
Oh, very nice. Now, have we got the marriages? Okay. So, now, if you're married, your household income will be the sum of those 2 cards, okay? All right. So you guys are now ready to calculate the Lorenz curve for your 2 tables for 1979. This is going to require that you communicate with the table next to you. Just, okay? So I know it's a large group, but basically you have to take the number of households and divide by 4 to figure out how many people or how many households are in each quartile. We're doing quartiles, okay? Any questions? I'll come around and help you if you need some help. You can turn the mic off now, right?
So we make households.
Somebody poorer than you. I'm sorry, you are divorced. You are now the head of your own household, as is your former spouse. Got that? Any questions on that? If your spouse has less income than you do on your purple card, you are divorced. How many people just got divorced? Raise your hand. Anybody else? Just, okay, that's cool. Huh? Still together. Well, yeah, you're going to have to redo everything. I'm just saying, we're not ready yet. Oh. No, you're going to have to, it's going to be difficult now. All right, next thing. If you have a purple card, let's make it a yellow card. If you have a yellow card, you may now exchange it with either the person's card on your right or the person's card on your left. They don't have a choice. You can exchange it. If it's your spouse, then you can skip them and move to the next one. Your household can exchange it. So if you got a yellow card, you can now trade it for any other player's card to your left or to your immediate right. Now, obviously, some of you just got poorer, and some of you just got richer. Okay, now, let us recalculate things using the lined side of your card now. Using the lined side of your card now. Take that number that you have and divide it by 12. Now, if you come up with a fraction, then just round it off. So let's suppose you got 48. Divide that by 12, and now you have 4. Okay? Then take that result and multiply it by 10, and that makes the 4 into 40. So if you got 48, your real income adjusted for inflation is 40. Okay? Does that make sense? So everybody must, I don't care what the price says on your card, everybody must divide their number by 12. And hopefully you guys have calculators. Divide by 12, multiply by 10, and that's your real income in today. No, divided by 12. Also, make sure that you're keeping households straight, okay? Did anybody get divorced over here? Oh, well, that's nice. What's that? Okay, let's resume, eh? All right. Now, what kind of results did you get? If it's as planned, you probably should have seen an increase in inequality shown by the Lorenz curve. Okay? And here's the interesting fact. The way I did those cards, if we had done income by individual, we would have shown that the real income of the poorest individuals grew faster than the richest individuals. So in other words, if we had just used the cards by themselves instead of using households, if we had used the price index that applies to each household, we would have seen that the gap between the rich and the poor is closing. Now, how many of you saw that in your results? You did. So, how many of you saw your Lorenz curve getting flatter and saw inequality going up? Yeah, okay. I mean, that's kind of what happens. That's what's it's kind of designed to generate, is a rise in inequality. But that's kind of odd. If the lowest incomes are growing faster than the highest incomes, shouldn't we see a reduction? And the answer is, well, no, that's the methodology of the Lorenz curve. It hides an awful lot of relevant information. So, for example, why do you suppose this happened? I know you did your reports, but I just want to hear from you. Why do you suppose the Lorenz curve gave a misleading result? What was happening? Give me one reason. Yeah.
You're looking at averages, not like individual cases and kind of do the lump sum.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not really getting an accurate picture.
Okay. So what kind of information are you not getting an accurate picture of? What happened when you traded cards? Did inequality increase or decrease? When you traded cards, what happened? The rich got poorer or richer? Poorer. The rich got poorer, and then the poor got richer, and did that change the Lorenz curve? What the heck? How many of you at your table saw somebody, a poor person get poorer, I'm sorry, a poor person get richer, and a rich person get poorer? Did that happen? Let's see the hands. Oh my gosh, so many. The Lorenz curve completely missed that. So the Lorenz curve takes no account of mobility, of people moving into a different quartile. It acts as if people who were in the quartile in the beginning are still there years later. Right? All right. Now let's see what happens when we look at some other measures of inequality based, I think, on more accurate approaches, more revealing approaches. This is median household income from 1976 to 2006. And you can see it's a slightly upward trend. It's relatively flat. And that could give the indication that income is stagnant. But what happens if we did it by individuals instead of households? Look what happens. Individual incomes are rising much faster. And you should know, based on your experiment, why this happens. What happens when an income is combined in a two-earner household? That household is, I suppose, counted as rich. And when they get divorced, they become two poor households. Okay? And to a large extent, unfortunately, this has been happening in the United States. We have smaller households. We have higher divorce rates. And we have among, and it is based on income to a certain extent, we have different marrying rates. And the chances that you're going to get married and stay married are higher as you move up the income scale. For those of you who did the bourgeois value pre-assignment, and one of the bourgeois values, the middle class value is, gosh, well, it wasn't expressed this way, but keep your car, keep your house, keep your wife, get rich. Okay? In other words, if you're always switching and going and spending and, then that's expensive lifestyle. Right? So changing household status plays a big role. And you can see how the mix of households has changed over time on this pie chart. Look at the number of married couples in 1976. Compare that to the number of married couples in 2006. And by the way, I'm not trying to create kind of culture wars or anything like that in here, but it does, it's a well-known fact. Marriage is economically good for the family. That's why I suppose marriage exists in the first place to a large extent, because two people can live better together than they can live separately. They don't have to maintain two households if they're together. Also, you notice it doesn't show up a lot, but what about these households? Can you read what that says? They're not married. Single males. And once again, I don't want to make any sociological comments on today's men or anything like that they're afraid of commitment or that they're a slacker generation or anything like that. I don't mean to imply anything like that, but single males do have higher unemployment rates. It seems as though perhaps they may not, well, they might delay to a certain extent taking on the responsibilities of being the breadwinner and so forth. We see that in the data. And to a large extent, that group is delaying marriage, and along with it, it's delaying that kind of income-driven lifestyle. Yeah.
I was just curious if you think that what also plays into that is women having more jobs or take it out for you.
Yeah. You're saying that the men, to a certain extent, are switching roles with the women of 30 years ago. They're staying home and taking more of the household responsibilities. Well, what do you think about that?
Says no spouse.
Okay.
Well, I mean, like, there's less jobs for the men, though, technically.
Oh, you're saying it's harder for them to find a job.
Yeah, and then at the same time, you might think that maybe some females aren't as willing to get married because they're focusing on their career.
Oh, it's harder for them to find a wife. So you want to put the responsibility for this situation on the women. I agree. It's worth checking out. I mean, it's a good theory. Now we just need some results. Unfortunately, I haven't looked at the results. As far as the housework idea, I know that shows up, but the women's household chores haven't really decreased very much. So it doesn't seem like the men are sharing that much responsibility for that. But nevertheless, this stuff makes a difference, right? This is the kind of stuff that matters to individuals, but it doesn't show up in the data. Okay. Now, there are differences in household composition. Depends on income. So, for example, in the upper income group, it's much more likely that there's going to be at least 2 earners in the household. At least 2 people in a household are going to have jobs. In the lower income group, it's more likely that only one of them, sometimes even nobody working. Look at nobody working here. In the bottom quintile, 39% of households have nobody working in the household. In the upper quintile, only 2%. Well, gosh, that seems to have a potential solution here. Now, our unemployment rate is nowhere near 39% or anything like that, right? So presumably, a lot of times, it could be that when this was measured, that person was unemployed, but maybe a few months later, they got employed, right? And yet, even though that happens, and they move into another quartile, you may find during the same period somebody in an upper quartile lost their job and moves into the bottom. Well, this churning between quartiles, we would expect it to happen naturally, and yet it does, extend the inequality. Same difference shows up in full-time. Look at head of household working full-time. What about age? Does that make a difference? So-called prime earning years, your 40s and 50s. If the head of household is young, we wouldn't expect their income to be very high, right? And look at the age of the heads of households in the bottom quarter. They're young people. What do we know about the income trajectory of young people? It gets bigger over time. They get promoted. They get experience, right? So no wonder they're having a little trouble at this point in time. Well, the fact is that in the Lorenz curve methodology, it's like this group is forever young. Just like you college students look to our professors. It looks like nobody's getting any older, but that's not true. That group has moved on, and now it's a new group of young folks that have moved in. It doesn't mean that somehow there's a problem here. Does it? Okay. Now, if we took this household composition into account, this is what the income distribution would look like in the United States. This is one of the popular figures reported. This is what Paul Krugman uses in his book. He says, look at the bottom quintile. Their growth in after-tax real income has actually been negative. They've lost a third of their income compared to the old days. Well, that would be true if they didn't grow any older, if they never got divorced, if nothing changed. But that's not true. If you take into account the changes in households, their income grew by 26% over this period. It's a huge discrepancy. Now, it's true, top income earners, their income grew by 52%. But still, I mean, I'm not sure that this is a real serious problem when, the growth in that bottom quintile is pretty strong. What about the middle class here? Look at them, that quartile. Huge. 2.2% is what's reported. That's why people ask a question like, is the middle class an endangered species? Well, I don't think anybody would ask the question if we looked at 36.9% based on changing household composition. Yes? Oh, you're shading your eyes. Any comments or questions on this? Yes?
A lot of people are saying that the middle class is actually shrinking. Do you think that's because a lot of people are seeing the shift in workforce, like from going to manual labor to more in business, and so the people that have created the middle class are now losing their jobs because of, let's say, lack of education, and then the new middle class that people don't see would be the up-and-coming business people of today?
I think so. You're talking about the process of moving from an industrial or manufacturing base to a more service or knowledge-based economy. And I definitely think that's true. I think what's happening is your fortunes and your ability to move up in the old days were based basically on showing up. Whereas now we know that's not enough. You have to have some human capital to a large extent. Now I think that's been exaggerated, but it's definitely an important factor. Good observation. Now the other thing is when you switched cards, we didn't take that into account. I mean, this previous slide we saw didn't even take mobility into account. What would happen if we took mobility into account? Now, in this case, what about mobility? This, I don't know if you can read this from where you're sitting, from 1996 to 2005, this is the number of people that moved up to the next quintile or higher. So the people that were in the lowest quintile in 1996, how many of them moved up over the next 10 years? 90%? Almost 91% moved out. What about the top 1%? A lot of them fell out of the top 1%, right? In other words, income mobility is important. So, how would we keep better track of inequality? What numbers would we want to use or look at? And it seems to me what we have to do is look at individuals over time. Don't look at cards or, quintiles or anything like that. Let's just ask people. Compared to 1979, what are you making now? Now, one study did this because it was interested in the popular question of whether or not the next generation will be worse off than its parents. So far, we've always managed to do better than the previous generation in our country's history. But a lot of people are talking about, in a pessimistic way, somehow the next generation is going to be worse off. Well, if you ask that question by looking at families and actually comparing over time the same family, in the top quintile, 43% of that group, their children are doing better than them, or over time. Same thing with every other group. What about the bottom quintile? They have the most people reporting, I'm doing better than my parents. Okay? But the key point here is every group, the children are doing better than their parents, for the most part. Here's another way of looking at the same data. You can see income growth. This is in the median for each quintile. You can see the median income. For example, here the median income, I don't see the year here. The median income here is $55,000. couple decades later, for their children, the median income in that quartile is $71,000. So the median income is growing, in this case, by 35%. This is just comparing the growth in the children's income compared to the growth, well, compared to their parents' income. All right. So much for inequality as measured by income. Yes? Yeah.
No, the next one, where the medians rise for children. Yeah. Isn't that the whole point, the rise in the top and whatever's above 83,000, the rise between the children, the parents and the children, in that percentile compared to the rise in the lower ones? As in, I understand it's not the same people that are stuck in that lower percentile,
Right.
but it's a difference between me now that I got rich, bigger between me and someone who's in that place where I was 10 years ago.
Can I interpret your question? I want to make sure I'm understanding, or your comment. I want to make sure I'm understanding. You're saying, if you look at these, they are compressed, whereas these are more widely dispersed. Is that kind of your point, or not? Okay. I think that's true. And, you know, I guess the reason why this data, I think, is important to me is because it does show that it's not as though the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. We see significant gains by quintile. And the other thing I would point out, that this particular slide, as you already said, doesn't actually show what's happening by individual. It just shows it by quintile. So the people in this quintile are doing better than the people in this, their children that are in this quintile today. But there are many of their children that may be in this quintile today. And this slide doesn't show that. Does that?
I think what it takes out of the equation, although it shows the rise in what they call inequality,
Yes.
I think it doesn't show the opportunity that people have,
Right.
which is I have been able to move out of my percentile and move up.
That's right.
And that's what it is.
Because what this is it's really a Lorenz curve for two groups of people, parents and children. But it doesn't show, you know, individually which children are in which quintile, right? And that mobility that you're talking about is a definitely, it hasn't changed. There's just as much mobility today on the individual level as there has been for previous generations of Americans. Okay. Now, we've spent a lot of time focusing on income, but when it comes to equality, I'm not sure income is the best way to capture that. If the idea is somehow you've got a much higher living standard, for example, than somebody else, a poor person, well, what do we mean by living standard? Is that equal to your income? What determines your living standard? What if your income is zero because you inherited $1 million and you know, you just have it in a shoebox somewhere, and whenever you want something, you just pull it out. Your income is zero, but your lifestyle's fine. This is how that lottery winner got his bridge card, right? He got a winning lottery ticket, but what's my income? I don't have any, so I need a bridge card. All right. So what we really want to keep track of is not income, but spending, isn't it? It's spending that will determine whether or not your living style is high or low. And when we look at spending, it's a lot more equal. In terms of consumption, especially when you look at the kinds of goods that poor people have today that they didn't have 20, 30 years ago. Things like they have more cars, more televisions, more square footage per person in their homes. In a lot of ways, consumption has gone up. I also want to point out that, well, that price index we did at your tables, that's been highly documented. Poor people have seen a much slower increase in the prices at the stores where they shop than rich people have seen. I mean, a poor person is more likely to shop on the basis of price, right? So they are careful. In other words, the goods they buy are relatively elastic. So the people that sell those goods in those markets have to be concerned about keeping their prices low. So if a poor person shops at Walmart, and Walmart, their whole image is based on low prices. Well, now a rich person, especially in the top 1%, I doubt if Bill Gates has ever shopped in Walmart in his life. Okay? And you can see this makes a huge difference. If you treat the cost of goods as rising at the same rate, you are systematically introducing a bias into this account. Okay. Here's another reason why this makes a difference. If you have a bunch of income, but it's all in the stock market and you're not using it, well, your living standard may not look that much different. What if you just happen to be a very thrifty person? For example, I drive a 1995 Chrysler Concorde to Northwood. I get a little bit embarrassed sometimes when I see a student getting into their brand new car and, you know. But the fact is, that's just the way I am. I'm not going to apologize for it. It works. So I drive it to work. And when I can no longer drive it to work, I'm going to get a new one. I'm not saying that's good or bad. But when you look at the car that I'm driving and you look at the cars that you drove here, can you really honestly say that I'm living large compared to you? So a lot depends on, are you saving? And it is true that wealthy people have more to save, but it's also true they save a higher rate. All right. Now, consumption is interesting, and I like to look at consumption, but here's an intriguing idea. What if we went one step further than consumption and looked at the actual utility gained from that consumption? What do you know from Economics 101 about marginal utility of income? As your income grows, what happens to the marginal utility of your next dollar? Is it? Yeah. Oh, what's marginal utility? Well, it's the change in your total utility or the change in your total satisfaction as you increase consumption by 1 unit. So, for example, if you were watching television last night for 1 hour, and what was your marginal utility in that? And then you watch it for another hour, what was the marginal utility the second? And what was the marginal? At a certain point in time, the marginal utility of watching television for you must have been 0. Unless you stayed up all night watching television. Because at a certain point in time, even though the TV was free, you shut it off. Okay? That extra half hour was no longer worthwhile. And that's the way it is with most goods that we consume. When you start to buy more and more and more, the marginal value of the next unit is a little lower than the previous unit. Now what this means in practical terms is, as far as that bottom quintile is concerned, we are not in a new Gilded Age. In the Gilded Age, you would have rich people who drive cars and poor people who ride the bus or walk to work. Nowadays, it's rich people have luxury cars and poor people have used cars. But they both have cars. Now, is the gap between somebody that drives a 95 Chrysler and somebody that drives a 2005 Lexus, is the gap between those two as large as the gap between a person who drives a car to work and a person who has to walk? No, it's a huge difference. So when you look at when you look at the actual utility that we get out of our money, the gap shrinks even further. Now, there's no way for us to create official statistics. This is more of an intuitive or a theoretical result, but I think it makes sense. Is the difference between a 20-inch TV and a big screen TV really that big? And is that going to justify calling this the new Gilded Age? Okay. Now, we're going to get off this equality kick for a while, and I want to talk about some other issues that came up in the experiment. If you recall, I distributed income. But in the real world, of course, income is not distributed, is it? So, when we're talking about equality, we could measure it by the distribution of income, but that's really misleading. We might call it distributive justice if everybody gets the same income. But in order to have distributive justice, we'd have to have individual injustice. So for example, this table, I distributed income randomly. Was that fair? Okay. This table over there, I distributed the richest people were the males. The men got more money than the females. Was that fair? And this table, if you could answer a question about the Freedom Seminar or about free enterprise, then you got more than somebody who got the question wrong. Is that fair? If you had to rank these three patterns of distribution from the most just to the least just, how would it work? Which one would you say is the most just? This table over here. Because the people who got the biggest paycheck were the ones that contributed the most within their group to, in this case, producing knowledge. But of course, in the real world economy, we produce all kinds of things besides knowledge. And the people that produce those things do tend to get a bigger share. To do anything different, to say, for example, that I'm not satisfied with that and I'd rather distribute it randomly the way I did here, to say that would create an injustice. Now, I will say this, there is no difference in the Lorenz curves at the various tables. It doesn't matter how you got the cards. You came up with similar Lorenz curves, right? So that means the inequality at this table is similar to the inequality over there where I gave it to the men and made the women poor. Same inequality. And when you look at the United States as an economy, you will see that people will compare the United States and the inequality in the United States to the inequality in some African country where it's run by a socialist dictator who has all the power to take what he wants and leave whatever he wants to his friends and otherwise leaves the population to fend for itself. Look, I don't care what the Lorenz curve says about the justice or injustice of the income distribution. Those are not comparable. The inequality that happens here, to the extent that we have a competitive economy and free enterprise, is of a much different nature than the kinds of inequality you get in authoritarian regimes. By a measure of inequality, I suppose we could say that North Korea is more just in many ways than the United States. Okay. Now, I am concerned about certain kinds of inequality that I think are increasing. And this doesn't show up by the Lorenz curve either, but it does show up by some other measures of the economy. For those of you that want to look up some research, there's an economist by the name of Kotlikoff, Lawrence Kotlikoff, K-O-T-L-I-K-O-F, I believe there's two Fs. And he's the guy that really invented this idea of intergenerational accounting. And what he has studied is the effect of government policy, taxes and spending, on the personal finances of each generation. And as you know, we have programs which redistribute income from generation to generation, right? We have a deficit that you learned about earlier this weekend, which is growing out of control. We have what's called a fiscal gap. I don't know what, I wasn't here for it, but you guys learn about our unfunded liabilities that the government has taken on. Huge. Compared to our official debt, our unfunded liability for Social Security and Medicare is overwhelming. Okay, well, what does that mean to people in each generation? What it means, people in your generation have become really the meal ticket for your parents and grandparents. The net rate of return on government projects to your generation is much lower than it has been to previous generations. And that's the kind of inequality that is real and I think is a cause for some concern. By the way, why do you think that kind of inequality exists? I mean, do you think parents purposely want to live at the expense of the next generation? Think they're aware of it? What's going on? Yes. Are you scratching your head or your hand up?
There's no more long-term planning. Politics is about getting to the next term, re-election, and so everything is done short-term, and nobody looks at the consequences of actions.
Okay. So the costs that are imposed on the next generation are costs that are not immediately visible. But the benefits, spending the money now, keeping taxes low, that's clearly visible to the current voting population. So you're right, we have kind of the benefits are easily understood and they're politically important. The costs that you keep kicking down the road to the next generation, those are tougher to really imagine or deal with. And I think that's a really important problem for our country. We need to get past that. So, where are we at this point? The growth in inequality has been exaggerated. I would say not only exaggerated, but even to the point of being borderline deceitful. It's almost irresponsible to report numbers without explanation. Now, having said that, I also believe that the pressure on the middle class is real. I think there are some real problems, and a couple of you have already raised some of them. So I think that there's stress that's on the middle class today that maybe wasn't there a few years ago, or a few decades ago. A couple years ago, there was a book that came out called The Two-Income Trap, which kind of made a splash at the time. And the book made a claim that it was easier to live on one income back in 1973 than it was to live on two incomes in in the year 2000. So the claim was made that, you know, we grew up, and this kind of fits into Paul Krugman's hypothesis of this kind of rosy days of the Great Compression. We all grew up in a family where Dad went to work and Mom stayed home and baked the cookies, and it was a kind of Leave It to Beaver 1950s sitcom America. Now, how could that be so easy, apparently? And now both Mom and Dad are working usually full-time jobs, and they seem financially strapped and stressed out. And well, the explanation given is this. You can kind of see it on this chart. If you look at some basic expenses that each family has in 1973, you'll see that to a certain extent, things haven't changed. The mortgage was 13% of household income in 1973. The median mortgage was 13% of household income in 2000. I mean, when you look at it as percentages, it looks pretty close except for two things. What are those two things? Taxes, daycare. Obviously, if you've got two income earners, you might have to put Junior in the care of a professional. Now, if you're lucky enough to have a relative or somebody like that, that's great. But even in the case that you have a relative, that's still there's an imputed cost or an opportunity cost of that. So that child care is a big expense. Well, that used to be produced in the home, so now maybe it's a wash. You're working outside the home, you're earning more than $9,000, so you should still be better off, right? You're earning more than enough to pay for that daycare. But wait a minute. First of all, you need an extra car, right? 2 cars instead of 1. So even if cars have become more affordable for single people, you know, compared to the family of the old days, you might have to spend a little more on that. But this is where it really gets you. Taxes. Right? from $9,288 to $22,000. Now, why did that happen? Well, look at your income, right? So we tax income. So if a spouse goes to work, not only do you have to get taxed on that spouse's income, but what else? You get taxed at the household rate. It moves you into a higher tax bracket. Also, if you've had any inflation between those years, that inflation would also result in moving some people into a higher tax bracket, even when their purchasing power hasn't necessarily increased. Now, I want to talk about, maybe you already have talked about, why are taxes so high? I mean, couldn't the government collect enough revenue if there's more people in the labor force, if the women are paying taxes and they didn't used to? Don't you think they could just, keep the growth in taxes, kind of like we kept the growth in mortgages, kind of in proportion? Couldn't we have done that? Yes, if government had still the same tasks in 1973 as they had in 2000. In other words, if government itself had not grown dramatically, then we wouldn't have had to have this huge proportionate increase in taxation. Right? Does that make sense? Oh, and I'm not sure whether I made it clear, but the thesis here is that after paying these expenses, and she's implying that that leaves both families with about the same amount of discretionary income left over. So I guess you could have growth in that middle class quintile, but even though you've had growth, it doesn't feel like growth. It feels like stagnation. All right. Well, if our budget really is getting squeezed by these items, which items in particular are becoming more expensive? Now, this was not on that particular slide, but I think that this is very important to a lot of folks, and it's talked about in the literature. The cost of education has been rising much more rapidly than the rate of general inflation. You guys are college students. I don't need to tell you that, right? Credential inflation, the cost of credentials, the cost of unlocking the door to your first job has been growing considerably. We are a society that is very strict in its credentials. You got to have a college degree to qualify for this job or for that promotion. Got to have a high school degree to do this or that. Is it really necessary for you to do a particular job to have a high school degree, or is it just a way for them to kind of sort out the wheat from the chaff in terms of their employment applications? Child care cost, housing cost, taxes. Another point of pressure, it's not really an expense, but it's still a source of stress, job churning. Today, the rate of people that are separated from their job involuntarily is higher than it was 30 years ago. People are switching jobs a lot more, sometimes on purpose, sometimes not on purpose. But the stability has diminished to a certain extent. Okay, I talked about the increasing cost of education. This is one reason why taxes have gone up. Even though the price of putting your kid in public school hasn't changed, the expenses of that school have gone way up. Because of that, property taxes have risen. Government, federal taxes have risen because they get a lot of support through the federal government now. $4,000 per pupil back in 1970 has become over $9,000 today. Now, I would like to say that the good news is you get what you pay for. But look at student test results. If you look at the results of standardized tests at age 9, age 13, and age 17, and you compare those results across the years, there really has not been any improvement. We've had a slight improvement for the 9-year-olds. So what's all that extra money going for? Not necessarily results. Okay, that's public schools. What about college? And you can see that with respect to public universities, we get the same pattern. This is the tuition rate at various kinds of universities. That dotted line is the private four-year university. Northwood would be in that group. The public four-year college is... Now, in a way, I'm kind of jealous of those public for it because they're able to see their costs going up much more rapidly than we are. And I think that's probably because they're getting a lot of their revenue from the government, right? Students don't pay the full cost. So when the cost increases, maybe the students' share of that cost goes up by a couple $100 while the university's costs go up by $1,000. And the rest is subsidized by the taxpayer. But this puts a lot of pressure on middle-class families. How? Because you got to send your kid to college, right? It's that ticket to a good job. You didn't used to have it in my generation, but now you got to have it. And it's a lot more expensive than it used to be. So, since it is so expensive, why are people still going to college? I don't know if you can interpret this graph properly, but this line here, this gray line, represents the benefits of not going to college and your earning profile over your lifetime. And this dark blue line represents your earning profile if you go to college. You start working later in life. That's why it's 0 here until you're age 22. But then you start making more money faster. You catch up, break even at around age 32. At that point, you've earned enough extra money compared to the high school grad that you've paid off your student loans with interest, and you're break even with that person. After age 32, it's all gravy for the college grad. He's got those premiums. Now, this is what people look at, and I'm curious to know, is this the message that got through to you if you went to an American high school? Did you learn college is important, and this is what happens if you go to college? Okay?
It's even advertised on TV, these commercials saying earn $1 million more in your lifetime by going to college.
It's good marketing. And it's a message that the universities, well, okay. Credential inflation. Warehouse supervisor wanted, bachelor's degree required, and the ability to lift 50 pounds. What do you think about that? Yeah. Which one is unnecessary? A smart guy can learn how to manage a warehouse. Don't want to be sexy here, could be a gal. Smart person can learn how within, I would say, a few months. How about taking one of your employees that's already there on the floor, that knows the warehouse, that may not have gone to college but is not an idiot, and train them to be the Why do you need, in order to promote them, why do you need them to go to school, spend $100,000, get a degree, so they can get that promotion and get a 50-cent raise? Okay. We have to be suspicious about that graph that I showed a minute ago. Okay. First of all, is that pay just because you're more educated, or is it just because you've gotten the credential? And if it's because you've gotten the credential, and that's the only reason you're getting paid more, then we are wasting a lot of money. The money that the middle class is earning and accumulating is being spent on something that adds no value to our economy. Now, I'm not saying education is not important. I'm just saying in terms of making that worker actually more qualified or more productive. If you get a degree in ancient Chinese poetry, I'm happy for you. But I'm not sure, well, I shouldn't, I don't want to pick on any particular major or anything, but I'm not sure that I would call that an investment in productivity. But here's the problem. There are people that used to go to school to learn about Chinese poetry, and they came from households that were willing to spend a couple $100,000 to get the best teachers in Chinese. And that was the kind of person that would go to college. People that really valued education for its own sake and not as a credential. But now what happens is you have people going to school that don't care less about Chinese literature, don't care less about history, or I should say couldn't care less about economics and Lorenz curves. And they're in college, and they're just hoping that it'll end soon. Why? So they can get their credential, go to that job, and get that promotion. Now, what does that do to the college experience for the people that are there because they really value the education and don't care about the credential? What happens in the classroom? I'm just curious to know if you guys have any ideas here. Well,
It ruins it.
okay, how?
Because you have people that don't care, that are the teachers need to kind of baby them, or they just don't know what's going on. They shouldn't be there in the first place.
Yeah.
And it just ruins it for everyone else.
It does dilute the quality of the professor-student interaction. It does dilute the actual, I would say, the service of education. It does dilute it a little bit, makes it worse. What you have is you're trying to pitch a lesson to a group of students, some of whom have no intrinsic interest in the lesson. Now, I will backpedal enough to say that at Northwood University, this is part of the Northwood idea. We believe in practical education. We're trying to give you stuff that will make you more productive from day one. Okay? But even then, some people just want to be an accountant so they can make money. Other people are actually, oh yeah, that's really cool. I want to learn more about that. The problem is the more people that go to college, I think, the less the quality of the college degree. Now, I haven't tested that. But, I mean, to me, it just seems to fit in with the whole concept of diminishing marginal returns. Okay. Well, the more people that go to college because they need those credentials, it means now more people are graduating from college. So is that credential going to separate you from the crowd when you go up for that promotion? No. So now what do you need? A higher degree. How about graduate school? MBA. PhD. College has become an expensive screening process, and we need to do something about that. Now, housing. You saw on that previous slide, two-income trap, that people are paying more for housing. Well, why? Why do you need to pay more for housing? Why, if families could live in a small house in 1973, why can't they live in a small house today? If you look at income growth, this blue line, this is the growth in the median income, and compare that to the cost of housing, why is housing growing so much faster than income? By the way, you see what happens with the collapse of the housing bubble, right? But even after the collapse of the housing bubble, look, it's still much higher than it was, 30 years ago. Why is housing so expensive? Any theories?
Commodity cost increase.
Okay, could be the cost and materials. That's a good thing. We could look at that. I don't think that's it, though. I think that, to be honest, people are buying bigger houses. They're buying more house. Now, here's an interesting thing. If you look at the affordability of those houses, this might explain why they're buying bigger houses. Affordability is really, even today, affordability is as high as it's ever been. That's why people are buying so much housing, because it's cheap compared to their incomes. Well, not compared to their incomes, I'm sorry. It's not cheap compared to their incomes. It's cheap compared to their monthly payment. What you have today is people who are making decisions based on a monthly payment. They're not looking at the housing price anymore. They're looking at their mortgage payment. Well, so what? Well, you heard what Professor Ebling said about interest rates in the last decade, right? What was happening to interest rates? Or maybe he didn't. I wasn't here, so. Yeah. Right. If you go back to 1979, you might have mortgage rates of 13%. Whereas now you can get a mortgage for less than 5%. And because a mortgage is a huge part of calculating your monthly payment on a house, you could have much more house for the same payment today than you could 30 years ago. Does that make sense? So people have kept their monthly payment the same. That's what this line represents. This is the monthly payment as a percentage of the median income. And that's actually been getting better. But this is a problem, I think, for the middle class. Why? Because those low interest rates are not going to last forever, especially with the policies currently in place. We have a very high budget deficit, which ultimately leads to higher interest rates. We have a very loose monetary policy, which ultimately leads to inflation and higher interest rates. What happens when these people have borrowed all this money at low rates, and then they try and sell their house in a market where there's high rates? It's not going to work out too well. I think we have dug ourselves into a very deep world of debt because people are focused on monthly payments and not enough on the actual debt that they're getting into. Same thing with cars. Same thing even with their credit cards. Everybody's focused on a monthly payment. Now, I want to talk next about health insurance and how that's gone up in price. But before I get to the health insurance part of it, I just want to point out that wages are linked to productivity. On this graph, these are two lines, and I couldn't even tell you which is which. One of those is productivity per worker, and one of those is employee compensation. And they overlap to such an extent that you'd be hard-pressed to tell the difference. It's productivity that drives compensation. But when you actually look at wages, the blue line here represents growth in people's wages. And you can see that blue line has stagnated through this period, grew a little bit here, and then started to stagnate again and even went negative. Wages have not been growing along with productivity. Why not? Well, because this red line represents benefits. Benefits have been soaking up all that extra compensation. They've been soaking up all that extra productivity. So you don't have the discretionary income offered to you by your employer. Your employer already paid at the insurance office. This is putting a lot of pressure on you. You don't feel like you're getting richer because you had insurance 30 years ago, you have insurance now. That hasn't changed, but your wages haven't changed either. Your compensation's gone up dramatically. And this is seen not only in private insurance markets, but in public insurance markets. This is Medicare, and this is from the trustees of Medicare who are responsible for projecting costs and benefits into the future. And you can see the blue line is the one you need to pay attention to. The blue line shows that by the year 2030, Medicare is going to take up 1/3 of government's total revenue. 1/3. Okay? Compared to the year 2000, it was only about 12%. This increase in the cost of Medicare is crowding out other types of government activities and other kinds of government services that people might have found useful in the old days. We just can't afford them as much. Because this one is... Here's another hidden cost that's been growing in terms of its burden. Regulation. The cost of regulation is the red bars on the chart. And it's a hidden cost. You don't see it, but it goes into the prices of goods and services that you buy. It goes into the wages that you receive. It's built into the structure of the economy. If you pass a law that says your company has to install new railings or, well, I'll give you an example. I'm on the board at the Friends of the Library back in Midland, the Grace A. Dow Library, and we have a book sale every year that raises money. And this summer, I'm the chairman of the book sale. I'm pleased to say it's in 2 weeks. If you're in Midland, you should stop by. And we're told this year that we cannot sell any children's books made before 1985. Why not? We get lots of donated children's books. That's a big seller for us. Why can't we sell them? Because the ink that may have been used to print some of the pictures may have contained lead. Now, does that mean it did contain lead? No, very few of them do. Well, they do contain some lead, but not to a dangerous amount. So, are there any of those books that are really hazardous to children? Well, no, most of them are probably harmless, but here's what you have to do before you can sell it. You got to prove that it's harmless. It costs over $300 to test a book for lead content. We're not going to spend $300 to test it so we can sell it for $1. We're just going to throw it away. Okay? Now that is an example of a regulation that's been imposed in a way that reduces the real wealth of the community. Now, I'm not saying every regulation is like that. I don't believe every regulation is like that. And some regulations are probably helpful. But there is a huge and rising burden of regulation. It also hits our opportunities very hard. If you want to go into business for yourself, for example, you want to braid hair for a living, can you do it without a license? No, you cannot. In many states, you need a license to braid hair, which means you got to go to cosmetology school, 2 years. It's going to cost you thousands of dollars so you can start braiding hair legally. Well, that's a especially stark example of overkill when it comes to regulation. But even the good regulations are tough on small businesses. If you look at the burden of regulation, it definitely hits small businesses disproportionately hard. Here's an example. Data from the Small Business Administration shows that on a per worker basis, let's say environmental regulation, let's focus on that. To comply with environmental regulation on a per worker basis, it costs a company with less than 20 employees an average of $3,328 per worker. How are they going to create jobs when they're already paying so much money on a per worker basis to comply with regulations, economic regulation? It doesn't really matter what kind of regulation we're looking at. For a small business, this is a significant cost. Now, a large business can take the cost of that compliance. They can hire a whole department designed to deal with compliance. And on a per employee basis, it might be just negligible. But for a small business, they can't afford to hire somebody who just deals with public policy issues and compliance and legal. So, I would agree, not entirely with the two income trap hypothesis. I think there are some mistakes which I didn't really talk about. But even though I don't agree entirely with it, I think our discretionary income is falling to a large extent. I think there have been some big claims on our income that have made it seem, well, actually have made it harder for us to appreciate all the wealth that we've been creating over the last 30 years. And we need to do something to gain control over that income again. We need to do something to control the rising cost of education. We need to do something to control this problem of credential inflation. We need to restructure our educational system so you don't need to take 4 years and $100,000 away from a poor family in order for their kids to have access to the American dream. Would you agree? So now the question is, what can be done to fix it? Now, before I talk about solutions, first of all, I'm not sure. You guys are probably due for a break, and I haven't been looking at the clock. So, what time is it? 10:45. Okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to continue straight on through, and we'll finish up a little early. For those of you that want to go back to your room and check out before lunch, you'll have an opportunity to do that. So I'm just going to go straight on through at this point. Because I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these solutions. That would be a whole other lecture topic. The main one, if I could focus on it, it would be education. The second one would be health care. And we could spend a whole weekend talking about those two topics. One thing I want you to notice, though, is look at the sectors that have been growing rapidly, whose prices have been rising more rapidly than the rate of inflation. What do you notice about those sectors? Yes, they're public, they're heavily subsidized. People don't pay for those entirely out of their pocket, but government pays a big chunk. Now I just want to check your economic principles knowledge. If the government gives you a $4,000 grant to go to college, of that $4,000, how much goes to the college student in terms of their personal wealth? Is it $4,000? Is it more than $4,000, or is it less than $4,000? Now, before you answer that, think about what is going to happen to tuition rates in America's colleges when every college kid gets another $4,000 worth of free money to spend on college. What's going to happen to tuition? I like the way you think. Why wouldn't it? I mean, demand goes up across the board. Now, when the student goes to look at colleges, and somebody else is paying, let's say, for some students, 70% of the bill. At a public university, if you're going to a public university, your tuition rate is small, and even for the amount that you pay, you might get government grants or loans. And so you're thinking, gosh, you know what? Should I go this place or that place? What do you look for? You're not shopping on tuition. What are you shopping for? Yeah. Oh, well, are you going to answer my question first? Or? Well, if you are shopping for the price, but let's put it this way. If we raise the tuition at $4,000 per year at Northwood, right, you would see all of that. But if the cost of a public university go up by $4,000, how much of that would the student actually see? Okay, right. And you're getting the taxpayer subsidy is going to fund the university and so forth. So maybe 1/4 of it would be on the student. So don't forget your question, but I want to make sure that this point is made. When somebody else is footing the bill, then people don't economize, they don't compete. Businesses don't compete on the basis of quality. They compete on the basis of what? How about sports? How about cafeteria food? How about the dorm? How about the library? How about student life? How about a bunch of stuff that's not directly related to academic achievement? Now, maybe indirectly related. Okay. Now, you guys went to Northwood. So I'm not saying Northwood competes on all that stuff, but maybe they do. Right? Does it make a difference whether the college has a championship football team? Okay, maybe it does. All I can say is that there seems to be any time when somebody else is paying most of the bill, the person who's paying is different than the person who calls the shots, who makes the choice. Businesses know that. So they don't bother to go after innovative ways to control cost, to keep their prices low. I mean, you see it a little bit here with the private universities. They're under a little bit more pressure to keep their costs low and keep their tuition. But really, there's not a lot of pressure for either place to keep their costs low because they're not competing on the basis of price. They're competing on the basis of quality, extras, bells and whistles. Well, we can't afford in the middle class and the lower classes to spend so much of our hard-earned income gains on bells and whistles. Can't afford it. We need more bare-bones educational opportunities. All right, now your question.
The government never really got into subsidizing higher education costs, grants, and all the combined funding they do. And if you think it was just left the private sector to offer scholarships and whatnot, do you think we would have seen the high rise in tuition as or would it stay more constant?
Well, there may be some reasons why tuition cost is rising apart from the ones you mentioned and the ones I've emphasized. So we might still see some inflation because of technological investments, right? And also because, to a large extent, colleges are still using that classroom-based instruction, and there's one professor and a class full of students, and that technology hasn't really changed, so the productivity hasn't really grown. So there'd still be some inflation, but I think it would be significantly less. I haven't seen a study that could tell me how much less. All I can say is, as an analogy, when you look at the airline industry, before it was deregulated, back in the 1980s, airlines could not compete on the basis of price. Government set the fares between cities, and the only way airlines could attract customers is by meals, service, the kind of personnel they hired, friendly, happy, cute, convenience and so forth. So the cost of flying was much more expensive, but I hear the experience was great. In the old days, you wouldn't have to deal with crowded airplanes with crying children, and, you know, you just got nice meals served at a leisurely pace with a pretty stewardess. And okay, well, that's fine if you can afford it. What happened when they deregulated was some airlines got the bright idea, I bet there are a lot of people that would fly if we could make it affordable to them. Well, we can make it affordable if we limit the quality of our food. Give them a bag of peanuts. We can make it affordable if we change the way we manage our personnel. We can make it affordable if we fill more seats. So I think it would happen as soon as price competition became a reality. And what we've said here is the same thing in healthcare. In healthcare, you need something very similar. I personally like the way it happens in Singapore. The way that it happens in Singapore is the government actually requires people to set aside a certain percentage of their income for their healthcare expenses. That stuff that they've set aside accumulates over the years until it reaches a certain amount. They also have to buy insurance, but it's not like our insurance. Their insurance only covers really important and rare and catastrophic illnesses. Well, if you break your arm, you take your money out of your savings account that you've accumulated and you pay for it straight up. If you get cancer, your insurance is going to cover it. As a result, people in Singapore shop not only on the basis of quality, but on the basis of price. So when you're going to the doctor, you actually ask him, how much is this going to cost? When my son burned his arm and he went to the emergency room, it cost him over $5,000. For what? Well, he waited in a waiting room. He had a nurse come and look at him a couple times. Then he had a doctor who came in and told the nurse what to do. Take out the dead skin and put a bandage on it. We got the bill next week, $5,000. Well, now, if that was coming out of my savings account, do you think I might have asked a little bit about, exactly what am I paying for here? Now, I didn't pay that bill. You guys did. How? Through tuition, thank you. Because Northwood offers health insurance to its employees, and Northwood's cost of health care depends on their employees' consumption of health care. And to the extent that I'm not careful about my health care spending, it goes into my salary, but more importantly, it goes into Northwood's costs, and Northwood's got to cover its cost through tuition. But that's true of every single business. We're not trying to help each other out at all. If we were trying to help each other out, we'd ask questions. Do I have to have that service? Is there a way we could do this more cheaply? And entrepreneurs would respond to our questions by designing better and cheaper ways of delivering what it is we really value. I would say that in all those sectors, most of the sectors I talked about, the way to increase entrepreneurship, the way to reduce the burden on the middle class, in a simple way of saying it, you need to reduce government subsidies to those industries because they're doing nothing but driving up costs. And do you have any questions? I do want to make sure, I know you're probably in a hurry to leave because you've been sitting for a while, but I do want to make sure that we leave at least 15 minutes for questions. So we're either going to stay here for 15 minutes and sit quietly, or we're going to have some questions. Yeah.
Do you see trade schools possibly being an alternative to kids going and getting a four-year degree?
Yeah, definitely.
You see more and more of them on the news, or I mean not on the news, but commercials and being advertised.
Well, it depends on the trade school, too. Even government is supporting trade schools to a certain extent. So, look, what I would say there is we don't have to reinvent anything. There are other countries around the world, they have ways of providing educational opportunities that are different than ours. We could do best practices. Trade schools would be part of it. We could do something like what Europe does, which is try to identify early in a kid's career what kinds of careers they're interested in and try to gear their educational path to that. Nice thing about our education system is we kind of give people a second chance. The problem with that is, you can screw around in public school or any elementary school, and you can get a second chance. But why do so many people in our system need a second chance? Why doesn't our system produce people ready to take jobs? Why aren't employers looking at our high school graduates and saying, wow, I'm so glad I'm here in the good old USA because look at the quality of high school grads I have applying for this job. We're not really tailoring our education at a younger age. We're not really tailoring it the way they might in some other countries towards getting people ready for the workplace. I think we could do better at that. Yeah.
So do you think it's going to be more necessary like later on, since you said that college is kind of just like a means of getting a job? Do you think it's going to be necessary for people to start getting their MBA instead of just a BBA?
Well, I think that age is already here. So yes, in answer to your question, now, will it go beyond the MBA? I think it could, but the next thing beyond the MBA, I suppose, is the PhD, and I don't think it'll get to that point. But no, I think it's already here. I know a lot of people have gone to get their MBA, trying to distinguish themselves from their colleagues that only have an undergraduate. Yes.
Do you see a shift happening from public education to private education through elementary and high school?
I think a lot of people would be happy to see that kind of shift, but I think right now the way the economics of it are, well, let's put it this way. In some parts of the country, you see some community grassroots efforts to give private schools a chance to compete on an equal footing with public schools. And this is the basic issue. If you want to support education with taxpayer money, there's no law that says that money has to go to the school. Why can't it go to the student? And then they could spend it at the school of their choice. That's the way we do our college system. If government gives you financial aid, you can use that financial aid at the school of your choice. And as a result of that, our college educational system, I think, is in better shape than our primary and secondary schools. Internationally, we're more competitive. I would love to see it happen, and it's happening in bits and pieces, but well, I think we need to support that. Yes? I believe it would lower it.
Because we're talking about vouchers, right?
Correct.
Okay. I think
Or tuition tax credits.
I don't think that there's much disagreement on the fact that private schools offer a better quality education.
Not always.
I understand you didn't put it that exempt from the University of Michigan, but if I was getting a voucher and was able to spend it wherever I wanted, why wouldn't that raise the cost of education? Why wouldn't it be adjusted?
Well, okay. Now here's where you are correct. Remember, we had this little conversation here about what happens to the $4,000. I think you would see an increase in the tuition rates at private schools. Okay. And so, to that extent, you are correct. But you limit the vouchers, first of all. You don't make them too generous. But second of all, you also have to keep in mind that right now we're spending, on average, more than $10,000, $11,000 per student. For families that have that voucher, they're going to shop around, it's true, on the basis of quality for the most part, up to the voucher level. But then they have to ask themselves, okay, am I really wanting to spend, let's suppose the voucher is $6,000. Do I really want to spend another $6,000 on top of that? And I think there's going to be a lot of families who say, no, what I'm looking for is a good $6,000 a year school, because that's what my voucher is worth. Now, if the government is spending $12,000 to educate a kid in the public schools, and they're giving a voucher of $6,000 to educate a kid in a private school, what happens to the average cost of education? It comes down. So I think you're right. Now, the public school may say, well, I'm going to raise my tuition now to $8,000. Or, well, it might happen. But I think there's going to be a limit to how much people are going to be willing to pay out of their own pocket. And that's going to keep the price competition healthy. We see something similar in this slide, right? Look at the private. Students are getting financial aid to go here, but that doesn't mean they don't feel the pressure. Right?
Well, inequality will go down, right? Because I'm looking at it from the perspective of you have vouchers, and now the public schools have to compete with the private.
If you think that in general the public schools have a higher quality than the private, then the quality of what would go down?
No, I'm saying right now, I think there's been statistical research that private high schools do a lot better job than public high schools.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to college, I mean, depending on which level of university you go, but if we had a voucher system, public schools would have to compete.
Oh, sure.
University spending would go down.
Right.
Think about their cost and offer
Right.
lesser education.
You're saying the quality at public schools might go down? Okay. I think that really does depend on the nature of competition. If public schools are feeling the heat of competition and improving their quality and they're spending that money in a way that generates results, then I would agree with you. But I would go back to this slide, which shows achievement, student achievement, and college and public school spending. I don't see that what they're really spending the money on is generating that big a difference in quality. But yeah, theoretically, you should be able to, at that price, provide better quality, but I'm not sure they're doing it. Yes?
Do you think then with the government subsidies are causing the free market to fail? In terms of, we use the education for example, they're providing the subsidies to the public university, so the university invests in things like a student life that the student wants. So they market it to them, and that's just the driven demand. So they're, marketing to their consumers and, getting them to come there rather than another school or really providing a lower level of education, just having the more frills.
Right.
So the student isn't getting the best level of education or even with the acquired skills that they would be going there for.
Yeah. Well, I have to confess, I went to a private school for elementary school, so maybe I'm a little biased. But I was also jealous of my public school friends. They had a lot more opportunities than I did. They could join the band. We had no band. They had a football team. We had no football team. For recess, when we went out to play, we didn't have a playground at the school. We went across the street. There was a public park. We played there. It just seems like we didn't have a lot of stuff that public schools generally have. But I don't feel that we were worse off because of it. And I think if you look at the test scores and the achievement of those kids that graduated with me, I think it'll compare very well. I think what those schools do, what my school did, was they really looked at this and they said, we want the kids to have a chance for sports. What's the cheapest sport we can give them? We want the kids to have, a chance for music. Well, what's the cheapest kind of music we can give them? Not pianos, right? So I'm just saying, when they cut judiciously, and they try to do it without affecting quality too much. Did it affect quality? Of course. But if it affects it too much, they're going to lose students. And they don't want that to happen. So they'll cut the frills before they cut the meat. Any other questions? All right. What time is lunch supposed to start? Supposed to start at noon. So what time is it now? 11:05. So we've got a break until noon. Now, when we come back after break, the first thing I want to do before I start my presentation is talk to you a little bit about the academic requirements for the course. And if you have any questions on that, I'll answer those right after lunch, okay? So enjoy your break and your lunch. Say it again?